Good morning. The committee will come to order. We were hoping to be able to move out two of our nominees that are currently pending before the committee. We obviously have to have the requisite number of members here. So until such time as we have a quorum, we will move to our scheduled full committee hearing on infrastructure permitting. If we're able to get the quorum of 12, we'll take up the business meeting at that point in time. I would anticipate that it would be relatively quick. So with that, we have names on the table in front of us, but I would invite you each to come to the table as I provide an opening statement. So Mr. Kaysen, Ms. Flieger, Mr. Turpin, Mr. Brown, Ms. Peruso, and Mr. Russell, if you just want to join us there. We are here today to discuss infrastructure permitting challenges, ongoing efforts to streamline federal approvals, and opportunities to improve the responsiveness, the transparency, and the predictability of our system of permit review. I think we all recognize the need to make investments that will both upgrade and modernize our infrastructure. We've had hearings in this committee, many hearings, to look specifically at the needs in the energy and the resource sectors. But as we continue to discuss energy infrastructure, I think it's important that we take steps to rationalize how projects are reviewed and approved. The existing regulatory regime impacts the cost-effectiveness of our federal infrastructure spending. Beyond that, the length and uncertainty associated with the permitting process limits the willingness of the private sector to finance, build, and operate energy infrastructure. This drives dollars overseas rather than into jobs and growth and prosperity for our nation. So whether we're talking about a pipeline, a mine, a power plant, a public-private partnership for a water system, or a company building a factory, we know that the deployment of capital is too often delayed, sometimes by years, and sometimes deliberately. When investment is impeded, how can we expect capital to be deployed here, where an environmental impact statement alone averages almost 5 years, and final approval can take a decade or more? You look to other countries, for example, Canada and Germany. They're moving similar projects in just a couple years. So I look forward to hearing from federal witnesses who are working to make our system work better and hearing about the permitting reforms of FAST 41, which we enacted roughly 2 years ago, and how those are being implemented. I'm also pleased to have 3 non-federal witnesses who have experience, they might say perhaps too long of an experience, navigating the federal permitting gauntlet for electric transmission, for hydropower and mining projects. New and upgraded transmission lines are crucial to a reliable and secure electric grid and to bring new sources of energy to our markets. And despite that, the number of federal, state, and local agencies involved in a single project makes permitting notoriously cumbersome. We've also talked at length in this committee about the challenges of licensing and relicensing hydro facilities. When I tell people about the time that is involved in a relicense, it's almost breathtaking. The need to fix the FERC process before the number of projects up for relicensing increases dramatically over the next decade. Finally, when it comes to permitting delays for new mines, our nation is among the worst in the world, and it's leading us to be dependent on foreign nations for the fundamental building blocks of a wide range of energy, defense, healthcare, and other modern technologies. The Energy and Natural Resources Act that Senator Cantwell and I reintroduced this year has provisions that take important steps to streamline project reviews in all 3 of these industries. This is an important bill that will help us make needed progress. But we also recognize that the challenges we will hear about today represent a subset of the infrastructure sectors that are also struggling to permit projects. So whether it's energy production, pipelines, pump storage, water supply, LNG, or something else, our system needs to be improved across the board. We absolutely have the ability to establish a permitting process that works, one that protects the environment and promotes state and local input while not miring projects in red tape and driving away private investment. And to achieve that goal, we have to set aside the misguided idea that accelerating or coordinating approvals somehow weakens those protections, or that simply spending more money will fix all the problems. It doesn't, we know that, and it won't work. Both common sense and experience tell us that we can maintain our high standards while speeding reviews and approvals. So I view this hearing as the next step in our effort to improve our nation's infrastructure. I look forward to the insights and ideas from our witnesses to do just that. Thank you all for being here with us this morning. Senator Cantwell, I welcome your comments this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I certainly welcome this infrastructure permitting oversight hearing, but I do think it's interesting. The Wall Street Journal reported just this last weekend that President Trump will roll out an infrastructure plan in January. It will propose $200 billion of spending offset by cutting other federal programs. So before we start the hearing today, I just want to remind my colleagues that the tax proposal before us is trying to be jammed through when we could be having this discussion right now about infrastructure investment. We obviously started the year with a lot of conversation between our colleagues, our leader, Senator Schumer, and Speaker Ryan about doing an infrastructure bill that got set aside. So I just want to make sure that people understand we've been more than willing to talk about our crumbling infrastructure for a long time. So this morning, we're going to hear about permitting reform, which is a good discussion, but we need an infrastructure bill that is about funding. I'm proud over the last 2 years that the chair, Senator Murkowski, and I have tried to address some of the permitting issues on hydro and critical minerals, and obviously we've passed legislation out of the Senate that has not made it through a final process because of our House colleagues' lack of interest in making sure that we take up these issues of improving hydro and other issues. So part of the issue, I believe, is making sure we adequately fund the permitting agencies. I'm pleased that Chad Brown is here from the Washington Department of Ecology, accredited. They have been credited with an innovative solution for hydro resources, and dam owners pool money to provide dedicated funds to complete water quality reviews on time. I believe this is a good model. I look forward to hearing more about it this morning. I think it could work on the federal level as well. And we should provide dedicated license fees directed to resource agencies. So I'm pleased that we have a witness who can speak to the experience with the Western Area Power Administration on transmission programs. I hope my colleagues will agree that federal programs that support investing in transmission deserve our support. And when it comes to the Department of Interior, I definitely want to make sure that we have some questions here. I think Secretary Zinke has been very abrupt in his actions at Department of Interior. It seems like it's just about whether you want a permission to drill, and if so, then you get the keys to whatever public lands. In less than a year, the Interior Department has left $750 million in taxpayer royalties on the table, and the Secretary has abandoned his obligation to stop natural gas waste, something that we basically here in the Senate said very strongly that we wanted to continue to see the management of methane flaring. So he has ditched sage-grouse plans negotiated by states. He has ditched master leasing plans. He has skipped public comment periods, illegally suspending regulations, and turned NEPA on its head. President Trump has allowed his advice to strip protection from 2 million acres and the largest rollback of public lands production in history, opening pristine desert area to drilling and mining. So the Washington Post confirmed over the weekend that the Department of Energy Fuels Resource petitioned Interior to open up Bears Ears to uranium mining, and Secretary Zinke has proposed even more rollbacks. So when it comes to having these issues this morning, I hope we'll take into context the larger things that are happening as well. I know that we'll hear a lot from our witnesses, and I remain committed to improving our process, but I also want to make sure that we are protecting those things that are in the taxpayers' interest. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Let's now turn to our panel. We're joined this morning by Mr. Jim Kaysen, who is the Associate Deputy Secretary at the Department of Interior. We welcome you this morning. Ms. Janet Flieger is the Acting Executive Director for the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Terry Turpin is the Director for the Office of Energy Projects at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Mr. Chad Brown, as Senator Cantwell has noted, is the Water Quality Management Unit Supervisor at the Washington Department of Ecology. We thank you for traveling cross-country. Ms. Roxanne Peruso is the Vice President and General Counsel for Transwest Express. Thank you for being here. And Mr. Luke Russell is with us from Hecla Mining Company, where he is the Vice President for External Affairs. So we welcome each of you to the committee. We would ask that you provide your comments in hopefully about 5 minutes or so. Your full statements will be included as part of the record, and once you have completed your comments, we'll have an opportunity for questions. And again, if we need to interrupt because we need to do a quick business meeting, we certainly hope you understand. Mr. Kaysen, if you would like to begin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I, for one, will be very happy with the break for what you're planning to do. Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Cantwell, members of the committee, my name is Jim Kaysen. I serve as the Associate Deputy Secretary of the Department of the Interior. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on the Department's efforts to improve the efficiency and accountability of federal permitting for infrastructure projects. I ask that my entire written record, or my entire written statement be incorporated in the record.
It will be included.
Thank you.
As will everyone else's.
Thank you. The Department is acutely aware that the President has a vision for empowering the private sector as well as state and local governments through infrastructure enhancements and improvements. Interior believes that creating greater efficiencies in the overall federal permitting process is crucial to addressing infrastructure needs. Executive Order 13807 ignited administration-wide assessment about how best to address inefficiencies in the current infrastructure project decisions that delay investments, decrease job creation, or are costly to the American taxpayer. In turn, the Department signed Secretary Order 3355, which includes setting page and time limitations for most environmental impact statements, setting target page and time limitations for preparation of environmental assessments, reviewing the Department's current NEPA procedures and providing recommendations to streamline the process, and implementing EO 13807 to the fullest extent possible. We believe our efforts to accelerate and streamline NEPA compliance efforts will also help us achieve our responsible energy development goals. Executive Order 13783 directed agencies to immediately review and report on all agency actions that potentially burden the safe, efficient development of domestic energy resources. In turn, the Department released the, quote, review of Department of the Interior actions that potentially burden domestic energy report on October 25, 2017. We believe the report is a useful tool to reduce the impediments to processes, including permitting to promote safe, efficient development of domestic energy resources. My written testimony further discusses Interior's efforts regarding offshore energy, as well as implementation of Title 41 of the Fixing America's Surface Transportation, or FAST Act. Chairman Murkowski, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee, and I look forward to answering questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kaysen. Ms. Flieger, welcome.
Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, known as the Permitting Council, was created by Title 41 of the FAST Act, known as FAST 41. FAST 41 brings accountability and transparency to what has been, for too long, an uncertain and unpredictable process. FAST 41 upholds existing environmental laws and statutory responsibilities of the 16 Permitting Council agencies. Additionally, FAST 41 is a voluntary program in which project sponsors apply to become covered projects. As Acting Executive Director of the Permitting Council, my office and the Council are bringing about a new way of doing business to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the federal permitting process for complex infrastructure projects in our nation. The Permitting Council is comprised of top leadership, Deputy Secretary or equivalent, so they can ensure permit streamlining occurs throughout all levels of their organizations, including at the very important field level. In addition, the Permitting Council is working with the administration to improve the permitting process through Executive Order 13807, establishing discipline and accountability in the environmental review and permitting process for infrastructure projects. The Office of the Executive Director, known as OED, oversees FAST 41 implementation and serves as a one-stop shop for project sponsors. OED is changing institutional behavior and culture, enhancing agency collaboration, resolving disputes, assuring transparency in the permitting process, and ensuring agencies better coordinate and synchronize environmental reviews and authorizations. My office is focused on 3 areas that I would like to highlight for you: early and formalized cross-agency coordination, increased transparency through the permitting dashboard, and project-specific coordination and dispute resolution. To my first point, FAST 41 requires the development of interagency coordinated project plans, CPPs, an essential tool for cross-agency planning and implementing best practices. The initial development and quarterly updates of CPPs formalize interagency collaboration. This allows difficult issues to be addressed early in the process to prevent confusion and delays later in the process. Moving forward, my office is working with agencies to ensure CPPs emphasize concurrent rather than sequential permitting actions. Earlier this month, the Permitting Council released its 2018 recommended best practices for infrastructure permitting. My office will be ensuring agency implementation of these best practices to generate efficiencies in the permitting process, and the Executive Director is required to report to Congress each April on agency progress. To my second point, the permitting dashboard brings an unprecedented degree of transparency to the process. The permitting timetables on the dashboard list target completion dates for permits. Each quarter, my office and the permitting agencies review those dates, and my office enforces restrictions for modifications to those dates. With nationwide visibility and a built-in accountability structure, the dashboard provides the public, project sponsors, and other stakeholders with clarity and certainty in the permitting process. To my third point, project sponsors have contacted my office for help with specific issues, such as when a sponsor received contradictory information from headquarters and field offices, or when agencies working together on a project disagreed on a path forward. A notable success in this area was my office using the FAST 41 dispute resolution process to address a stalled review. The resulting coordination among agencies allowed subsequent authorizations to move forward and, as relayed by the project sponsor, saved an estimated 6 months and $300 million in capital costs to the project. Going forward, my office will continue to use the FAST 41 tools of oversight, transparency, collaboration, and accountability to improve the permitting process. The fiscal year 2018 President's budget request of $10 million provides the funding support we need to fully use these FAST 41 tools. As new projects come on board from the start, they will benefit from the enhanced transparency, coordination, and agency accountability of FAST 41. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Flager. Mr. Turpin, welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee. My name is Terry Turpin, and I'm Director of the Office of Energy Projects at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The office is responsible for taking a lead role in carrying out the Commission's duties in siting infrastructure projects, including non-federal hydropower projects, interstate natural gas pipelines and storage facilities, and liquefied natural gas terminals. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss federal infrastructure permitting and the Commission's processes for conducting environmental reviews required under the National Environmental Policy Act. As a member of the Commission's staff, the views I express in my testimony are my own and not necessarily those of the Commission or of any individual commissioner. Under the Federal Power Act, the Commission regulates over 1,600 non-federal hydropower projects at over 2,500 dams. Together, these represent about 56 gigawatts of hydropower capacity, which is more than half of all the hydropower in the United States. In the last 5 years, the Commission has authorized 71 new projects with a combined capacity of over 2,400 megawatts and has relicensed 42 projects which continue to provide over 91 megawatts of generating capacity. The Commission is also responsible under the Natural Gas Act for authorizing the construction and operation of interstate natural gas facilities and facilities for the import and export of natural gas. Since 2000, the Commission has authorized nearly 18,000 miles of interstate natural gas pipeline, which totals more than 159 billion cubic feet per day of transportation capacity, over 1 trillion cubic feet of interstate storage capacity, and 23 facility sites for the import or export of LNG. For both of these types of infrastructure, the Commission acts as the lead agency for the purposes of conducting coordinating federal authorizations and for the purposes of complying with the National Environmental Policy Act. As described in my written testimony, this environmental review is carried out through a process that allows cooperation from numerous stakeholders, including federal, state, and local agencies, Native Americans, and the public. The Commission's current approach allows for a systematic and collaborative process and has resulted in substantial additions to the nation's infrastructure. To a great extent, the processes envisioned by legislation such as FAST 41 and the recent Executive Order 13807 parallel the Commission's own approaches in improving early consultation and increasing transparency of project review. Commission staff is committed to working with all federal agencies to assist in the successful implementation of these goals and to ensure the most effective processing of infrastructure matters before the Commission. So this concludes my opening remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Turpin. Mr. Brown, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Madam Chair, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting the Washington State Department of Ecology to speak today. For the record, my name is Chad Brown, and I supervise a team of staff responsible for the development and implementation of our state water quality standards. Washington State is fortunate to have more hydropower energy than any other state in the nation. With this valuable, renewable, and carbon-free resource and its importance to our state, also comes the responsibility to manage a variety of regulations associated with the licensing of these energy projects. Among these is the responsibility to ensure that water quality is sufficient to support swimmable and fishable rivers. As the water quality authority in the state, Ecology's work includes the issuance of state certifications for hydropower projects licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. These certifications are issued through authority provided to the states under the Section 401 of the Federal Clean Water Act. These 401 certifications provide assurance to hydropower producers that their projects' development and operations will meet applicable state regulations. In the last decade, several large hydropower projects in Washington completed the FERC relicensing process. In this period, Washington successfully issued 16 401 certifications, which accounts for more than 2/3 of all FERC-regulated hydropower in our state. This was a significant effort for our agency, as well as for the hydropower producers. Yet, we met the challenge, and we met this challenge collaboratively, in large part due to the financial support provided by the hydropower industry through Washington's water power license fee program. The fee began in 2007. In collaboration with the hydropower industry and other stakeholders, Ecology worked with our state legislature to institute a new fee based on the amount of water that each licensed project uses to generate electricity. By basing the fee on the quantity of electricity a project can produce, the fees are distributed in a manner consistent with each project's revenue-generating capabilities. For a decade, these fee revenues have helped support the regulatory workload to efficiently and effectively meet licensing timelines for new and relicensed hydropower projects. The Washington State Legislature recognized that this fee program was not without controversy, and therefore included a provision requiring periodic reporting on the use of fee revenue. The reporting provides oversight and ensures accountability to periodically determine whether to continue assessing these fees. We utilized this provision in 2016 as we engaged with the hydropower industry and stakeholders to review the program, improve the quality of service, and increase the transparency of the spending of these revenues. With this, the state legislature extended this program to the year 2023. The Washington State Department of Ecology recognizes that the importance of finding efficiencies and improving licensing procedures in new and continuing energy projects. The water power license fee revenue model has become one such successful strategy to support this efficiency. We also acknowledge that there is room for improvement through federal legislation. House Bill 3043 and Senate Bill 1460 both contain language which would act to improve the FERC licensing process. However, we believe that it is important that any new legislation be consistent with the current federal and state laws and maintain appropriate authorities in place to ensure the protection of natural resources. My agency has provided comment on similar bills in past legislative sessions, and we appreciate the improvements that were made in this regard. We have confidence that through collaborative development and review, final legislation can meet both goals. It is important that certifications, permits, and other authorizations required to license energy projects be defensible in order to avoid challenge from project opponents. Any legislation that would improperly abbreviate environmental review timelines or otherwise limit the authorizing agency's ability to fully carry out environmental studies may lessen the defensibility of these projects. Limiting the ability to complete a full environmental review may exchange efficiencies gained in the licensing process for greater delays in the courts. In closing, the Washington Department of Ecology supports the legislative intent of Senate Bill 1460 to improve licensing procedures, and we also believe that it is imperative that final legislation also protect the current independent authority of states to ensure that projects meet important environmental regulation. We also thank you for the opportunity to highlight our fee program as a means to improve one step in the licensing process. We believe that the success of this program stems from the early engagement of hydropower producers and proper funding and dedicated staff, which effectively retains expertise and supports continuity and consistency within the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Ms. Peruso, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Cantwell, members of the committee and staff. I'm Roxanne Peruso, Vice President and Associate General Counsel of the Anschutz Corporation. Anschutz has been active for more than 75 years developing energy and resource infrastructure in the West. We've spent the last 10 years working with the Department of Interior to develop 2 large energy infrastructure projects. The first project is the Chokecherry and Sierra Madre Wind Energy Project, which is located in Wyoming and consists of up to 1,000 turbines with 3,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity. We applied to the Bureau of Land Management for a development grant for the wind project in 2008. And after preparing an environmental impact statement and 2 environmental assessments, in 2016, the BLM authorized initial construction of the wind project, and we started construction in 2016. The second project is the Trans-West Express Transmission Project, which is a 730-mile high-voltage direct current transmission line that crosses 4 states, 14 counties, and multiple federal jurisdictions, including 10 BLM field offices, 2 national forests, as well as Bureau of Reclamation lands. And we applied to the BLM for a right-of-way grant for the Trans-West project in 2008. The BLM and Western Area Power Administration acted as joint leads on the environmental impact statement, and the BLM issued a right-of-way grant for the transmission line 9 years later in 2017. Our hope is that the challenges that we faced in permitting these projects will provide opportunities to improve the process. But before I address the challenges, I want to acknowledge and thank the numerous federal employees that we've worked with over the past 10 years and continue to work with. And they are a very big part of why the projects are where they are today. But based on our experience, we do believe that federal permitting, that process, especially for large multi-jurisdictional projects like Trans-West, can be significantly improved through 3 things: increased consistency in policy, coordination with appropriate corresponding decision-making authority, and finally, accountability. One of the greatest challenges that we encountered was lack of consistency. We were faced with ever-changing policies. 2 examples of significant policy changes that impacted us were 1, Interior's policy on mitigation, and 2, the BLM's competitive leasing rule. Over the last 9 years, Interior's mitigation policy was revised 7 different times, resulting in project delays and additional costs as the goalposts kept getting moved. Next, the BLM's competitive leasing rule was issued in December 2016. That's more than 8 years after analysis on our wind project began. But this rule significantly affects the economics of the wind project by raising the rents over the life of the development grant for the wind project by about 60%. So our recommendation here is that policy revisions should be carefully considered and should clearly direct agencies on whether and how the new policy should be applied to projects that are already in development. Next, coordination and communication with corresponding decision-making authority is essential. For TransWest, for example, routine coordination calls were held weekly and monthly, yet after having these calls for more than 5 years, major issues remained unresolved. And while attempts at coordination and communication were in fact made, ultimately, it was the lack of timely agency decisions or lack of line authority to ensure that decisions are made and issues are resolved that resulted in substantially increasing permitting delays and costs. And finally, there's a lack of accountability regarding schedule and budgets in the federal permitting process. Both our wind and transmission projects, the original schedule and the estimated budget more than doubled. This budget and schedule uncertainty and risk discourages the very development of energy and resource infrastructure that on federal land that the government is seeking to encourage. Now, we do believe that the FAST Act and CEQ's involvement are, in fact, a very good step forward in addressing these issues. However, there needs to be accountability at every level such that agency personnel understand the work they're doing is very important, it's time sensitive, and it has real consequences for project proponents like us and also the development of the nation's infrastructure. In conclusion, while we acknowledge that the permitting process for large, multi-jurisdictional projects like ours will always be complex, reducing the permitting time, cost, and complexity is achievable and it is necessary. And this, in turn, will encourage private investment in energy infrastructure projects and federal-private partnerships. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these remarks today.
Thank you, Ms. Prusa. Mr. Russell, before we go to you, we are going to interrupt for this very important business message. We do have a quorum, and recognizing that some members have competing hearings that they need to go off to, I would like to move to this business meeting very, very quickly. We have 2 nominees. Our first nominee is Dr. Tim Petty, who is nominated to be the Assistant Secretary of Interior for Water and Science. Our second nominee is Dr. Linda Capuano, who is nominated to be the Administrator of the Energy Information Administration. Let's see here. Unless there are no objections from members here, the committee will vote by voice on the nomination of both Mr. Petty and Dr. Capuano. Is there any objection to voice votes? Seeing none, the question is first on the nomination of Dr. Petty to be an Assistant Secretary of the Interior. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The nomination is reported favorably. Is there any senator who wishes to be recorded as a no? Seeing none. We will now move to the question of nomination of Dr. Capuano to be the Administrator of the Energy Information Administration. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. No. The ayes have it. The nomination is ordered favorably. Is there any senator who wishes to be recorded as a no? Senator Heinrich? Senator Hirono? Okay.
Madam Chair, if Senator Franken could be recorded as opposed to Dr. Capuano's nomination.
Senator Franken will also be recorded as a no to Dr. Capuano. That concludes our votes. The business meeting of the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources is adjourned, and we will now turn back to our full panel. I thank members for coming here, and I thank the panel for your indulgence as we concluded that business meeting. So, Mr. Russell, you are last up on the panel. We welcome your comments before us this morning. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Murkowski, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee. My name is Luke Russell. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs for Hecla Mining Company. We are the United States' oldest and largest silver producer and third largest producer of lead and zinc. Metals and minerals are the building blocks of our nation's infrastructure. Simply put, it is impossible to create infrastructure without them. To quote our President and CEO, Phil Baker, at the end of the day, you can't have the infrastructure and everything that goes with it if you don't have the underlying commodities that go into the bridges and roads and everything else. Silver, copper, and zinc are just three important minerals associated with Hecla's operations, which are also key minerals for infrastructure and renewable energy. A single wind turbine contains 335 tons of steel and almost 5 tons of copper. The primary ingredient in most solar panels is silver, and zinc is a component in battery technology critical to the future of electric vehicles and energy storage. The United States is blessed with world-class mineral endowment, but sadly has become increasingly dependent on foreign sources of minerals. We are now import dependent for 50 different metals and minerals and 100% import dependent for 20. The length of time it takes to secure permits in the U.S., which takes an average of 7 to 10 years or longer, is a key reason behind this dependency. In addition, it is making the United States less attractive for investment. As an example, we were at a mining business development conference in Bear Creek, Colorado earlier this year. We spoke to companies about 70 projects to invest in. Only 2 were in the United States. Let me share an example of the very long timelines I've been involved with permitting. As one of the largest private employers in Southeast Alaska, Hecla's Greens Creek mine went into production in 1989, some 16 years from discovery to first production, and has operated in harmony with sensitive environment conditions for more than 28 years. With that history, one would expect that a plan for a minor expansion could be permitted expeditiously. Unfortunately, our experience proved otherwise. Permitting a small 10-plus acre expansion took more than 5 years and added just 10 years to the mine's life. So, we're already preparing to start the permitting process again at a cost of millions of dollars in order to avoid shutting down the mine and laying off workers due to a lack of permitted tailings capacity. Prior working to Hecla, I worked with Coeur Mining, which owns the nearby Kensington mine, also in Southeast Alaska. Permitting of that mine started in 1988, and with permitting delays and litigation, first production did not occur until 2010, some 22 years after initial project permitting. Hecla recently acquired the Rock Creek project in northwest Montana, which is the largest undeveloped silver and copper project in the U.S. This project has been in permitting and litigation for over 25 years and counting. Now, to be clear, valid concerns about environmental protection need to be fully addressed and considered. At the same time, we should not confuse the length of the process with the rigor of review. In my experience, permitting delays are frequently caused by inefficient and duplicative processes that do not improve the rigor of review. While mining is complex, there remain some of the permitting agencies that lack training on minerals and mining and the NEPA process. This serves only to exacerbate delays in the process, which is driven by a lack of firm timelines, accountability for permitting, and unreasonable exclusion of project proponents in the process. Well, what can be done? Chairman Murkowski recently introduced legislation that would allow mining projects to be eligible for consideration as covered projects under the FAST Act. Clearly, expedited permitting regimes for infrastructure projects will have little or no effect if the mines that supply minerals and materials to those projects do not have the same accelerated process. In addition, there's a great opportunity for the identification of regulations and policies across the federal agencies that needlessly delay or prevent mineral resource development, further jeopardizing the viability of our needed infrastructure projects. This can be accomplished by identifying a lead agency, selecting clear and defining clear roles of cooperating agencies to avoid duplication, establish clear timelines, and provide accountability and predictability to the process. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. I think we've heard, we continue to hear that uncertainty, unpredictability within the regulatory process. It adds time, it adds money, and you know, when you mention the length of time that it takes to permit a mine in this country nowadays, Mr. Russell, you know, the two projects that you mentioned in Alaska, 22 years for one, 16 for another. For many, they would just walk away. You know, you look at the reality of the process here, and it does cause you to wonder how we're even able to have much of a mining industry in this country. You know, we speak about how the United States is ranked literally at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to permitting for mines in this country. I've also heard about how other countries, specifically Canada and Australia, have a competitive permitting. Well, it's a permitting process, I guess, that gives them a competitive advantage. Now, we have had some issues with some of the mines that we're seeing come on in Canada. But can you speak just very briefly to the permitting process that we see in other countries that, again, allow for a more clearly defined or certainly more predictable process that allows these projects to move forward, while here in the United States it may be a 2-decade process?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I have experience in permitting in both those countries, Canada and Australia. And I think the key difference is that there is a time frame established at the beginning. The roles and the responsibilities of the cooperating agencies are well defined, so that there is certainly more predictability that the process will take 2 years or 3 years, and then there will be a decision. What we have is
accountability at the end of that.
There's also
period?
accountability, so that if an agency is not moving within its time frame, there is accountability. So that's a key aspect that's lacking in our system, is that even if schedules are established, there is no accountability to meet those schedules.
Mr. Kaysen, you in your testimony had mentioned that an average EIS is now about 4.6 years, and we think about the reality of that and what that then means to cost, uncertainty, lack of predictability. During the Obama administration, President Obama acknowledged that permitting challenges were an impediment. They held back growth and opportunity. And in his 2012 executive order, he pushed us to work through some of the permitting challenges. And then when President Trump comes into office, he updated that in August of 2017. What actually have we seen then? If we're still sitting at about 4.5 years for processing of an EIS, we've had administrations, Republican and Democrat, that have said permitting is a challenge. They've laid down executive orders saying we need to do better than this. Have we accomplished anything?
Accomplished at this point, I think, is pretty thin, but we are working on the issue. We have several things that are going on at the same time to try to address this issue. I say broadly in the administration, recognize that the NEPA process is taking way too long. You've quoted almost 5 years to get an EIS done. And there's a couple of things that are involved in that. First is that the length of EISs keeps getting longer and longer and longer. The last two that I saw was 5,000 pages and 10,000 pages. And
is it necessary that the EISs get longer? Why?
No.
I mean,
no.
If we acknowledge that this is part of our challenge here, why are things getting longer and more complicated?
My opinion about that is that a lot of the length is generated by two things. The first is a lot of contractors get paid by the page, and so the more pages they write, the more they make. And secondly is fear of litigation. We have a fairly long record where EISs are found, no matter what their length, to be insufficient, and so you need to add more and more to it. So we've been trained basically to make them longer and longer and try to anticipate every possible question that anybody in the world might want to have an answer to and try to incorporate that in EISs to offset the fear of litigation. I don't think that's the way it has to be. We're currently working with CEQ and with the White House and across the executive branch to take a fresh look at how we do NEPA compliance. And we're going through a process right now within Interior where our Deputy Secretary has issued a secretarial order that basically puts a page limit and a time limit on our NEPA compliance documents. It remains to be seen whether we'll be able to deal with litigation using these reduced page limits. But what we're going to try to do is move in a direction, instead of having a 10,000-page EIS, have an EIS that's 300 pages or less and gets done in a year to 2 years. So we're currently going through the process with a NEPA subgroup inside Interior, which I chair, to look at the entire NEPA process to figure out what can we cut out, what can we streamline, how can we write these better so that we can do them in less volume and less time. So that's an active process we're going through in concert with CEQ.
Thank you. And I recognize that the number of pages is not the end-all and be-all, it's the content in there.
Right.
I certainly hope that you don't work to reduce the font because it's already tedious enough to get through. Let me go to Senator Cantwell.
Mr. Brown, you mentioned in the statement about your support for the Senate language on hydro relicensing. I take it you don't like the House languages. Is there a problem with it? Could you explain that?
We believe that the House language may act to preempt authorities under the Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. The language, including certifications as a federal authorization, and then modifying the timelines and having authority over what studies should be appropriate for the issuing of that 401 certification. I think the language can be improved and allow for showing of state authority without preempting it.
Thank you. Ms. Persuo, one of the things I find puzzling is this issue as transmission infrastructure program and the proposed elimination of WAPA's borrowing authority. Can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you, Ranking Member Cantwell. Yes, thank you, Ranking Member Cantwell. We view the borrowing authority as WAPA's borrowing authority as written by Congress as a very important program that creates public-private partnerships. We've been working with WAPA since 2011. WAPA acted as a joint lead on the EIS with the BLM, and they've provided development funding for the project. We have viewed WAPA as our partner, and we want to keep them in the project. I will say that WAPA's interpretation of how they can use their borrowing authority has changed over the course of our relationship with WAPA. We believe they are not interpreting it the way that it was set out in the statute. And that is a concern of ours because it is incredibly difficult to build interstate transmission, and so WAPA can play a very important role. And a partnership with them provides an independent transmission developer like us with credibility. And so we really want to see WAPA participate in this project.
Thank you. Mr. Kaysen, you stated at your confirmation hearing that you wanted to get a fair return for the taxpayer, and since then the department has reinstated the outdated low-priced coal leasing. You guys have tried to suspend the methane rule, leaving millions of dollars on the table as far as royalties. You have suspended the royalty valuation rule by your own estimates, giving back $75 million a year to oil and gas and coal companies. The Secretary has created the Royalty Policy Committee stacked with partisan members without a single public interest voice. So it seems to me you're leaving a lot of money on the table.
Sorry. I guess that's a point of view. Thank you for sharing it. The department is taking a look at each one of these rules that we're working on right now to make modifications that we think in the end will provide benefit to the American public. In some of these cases, the royalty rules will be looked at by the Royalty Policy Committee, which has about 20 members on it, representing states and Indian tribes and the industry and Department of Interior and others, to take a look at how we fashion rules. A lot of the changes that were made there were related to how we view deductions or credits that come as part of the oil and gas development process and the marketing of oil and gas. The other rules, venting and flaring, you mentioned, there were a lot of problems with the venting and flaring rule that is, I understand it from the conversations I've had Interior. The industry and Interior, neither one were well prepared to implement that rule, and that it has certain complications that we were attempting to levy royalties on methane that was vented when we didn't have the presence of gathering lines to actually gather the materials. So we're going back to basically a conservation of resource thought process. We too want to capture the methane. We just need to do it in a deliberate way. And we thought improvements to the rule would help with that.
Well, thank you. I think Congress has spoken on that, so I'm sure you'll hear from other colleagues of mine about their concern. And I just will note, we have had improvements in hydro relicensing. My colleague from Idaho and I worked on those in the 2005 bill, and it improved the process. And I do think it's challenging for people to think of hydro relicensing in the context of, you know, a 50-year relicensing process that has basically about managing and stewardship of a resource. But I will say that when people try to get the upper hand is usually when it goes wrong. What we have seen is when people come to the table and comply and look at the resource and look at the management of these issues in a collaborative fashion, you have a very quick process. But yes, there's a lot of I's and a lot of T's to cross, but we have made progress. And so I hope you'll go back and look at that and understand that there is great responsibility here. And it is not just about the size of or how many pages it is, but about whether people are going to come to the table and collaborate. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cantwell. Chair Murkowski asked me to take over for a moment while she stepped out. The issue of excessively long permitting timelines is becoming all too common. I'm very glad we focused on this issue multiple times this year, and I hope we don't let up until we see some improvement. And as chair of the Senate Western Caucus, when our members develop priorities for any infrastructure package, streamlining the permitting process, like we're talking about here today, was a top priority, and we will continue to encourage actions and hearings like this. Debilitating permitting infrastructures and timeframes affect all of our sources of energy and our natural resource production. We have wind, we have coal, we have hydro, we have mineral projects held up for years, sometimes even decades in places like Montana. This is leading to less investment, less made in America energy, and less jobs. Mr. Russell, as you well know, the Montanore and Rock Creek projects located in Lincoln and Sanders County in Montana. By the way, if you Google poorest counties in each respective state, Sanders County is the poorest county in Montana. Double-digit unemployment rates, poverty rates in excess of 22%. And Lincoln County, recently I was having dinner with a couple and up in Lincoln County, and they said to me, Steve, basically we describe Lincoln County as poverty with a view. That is where the mines that you're talking about, Mr. Russell, are located. They will produce 2 of only 4 world-class silver and copper deposits in the U.S. These projects have been thoroughly vetted, thoroughly researched, thoroughly reviewed. Beginning back in the 1990s, you mentioned in your testimony it's 25 years. Cindy and I have 4 children. They're now all adults. My children, in some cases, weren't even born yet when you began the permitting process for the Rock Creek and Montanore projects. Mr. Russell, you mentioned the Rock Creek project in your written testimony. What can we do on this committee to make sure that projects like Rock Creek and Montanore, which bring critical minerals and metals, millions in wages and tax revenue? By the way, when I met some of the county commissioners up in that part of our state, one of our county commissioners sat across the table from me and said, we are at the point now in our county, because we've lost the revenue stream on our federal lands. In some cases, they're 90+% of the lands in those counties are owned by the federal government. We've lost the revenue stream. They have no tax base. They literally are having to plow the roads in the wintertime as county commissioners because they had to lay off the road crews to get the kids to school buses to get through. So what do we do here? What do we need to do so these projects don't languish in a never-ending permitting loop?
Senator, thank you. I might notice the comment that the Rock Creek project over its life was forecast to generate $170 million in state and local taxes. That would go a long way to plow some snow in Sanders County. I think to answer your question is that some of the key things that you've heard today is that we need to get more predictability and certainty in our timelines, have accountability on that timeline. That doesn't mean the review has less vigor. It's just that we set a predictable timeline. There needs to be better coordination with the agencies. An example in the Kensington example that it took 5 years to minor expansion, the EIS was completed in 4. The Corps of Engineers then took over a year to issue its permit. So rather than working conjunctively, they worked in sequence, and that added 25% to the timeline. And then thirdly, you've also heard this morning, is the fear of litigation creates analysis paralysis. So there has to be some sort of a way to address the Equal Access to Justice Act or repeat litigants that continue to thwart economic development, responsible economic development, especially in poor counties like Sanders and Lincoln County, which I believe is just a blatant environmental justice issue where these folks are very concerned about their environment, as you said, room with a view, but also believe that they can have responsible economic development, and it's a false choice for them to say it's one or the other.
And the thing that's taken a quarter century and still counting here on the Rock Creek project, to me, is outrageous. Mr. Turpin, in the remaining time I have, as I mentioned, permitting delays don't only affect our mining projects, but renewables like hydro and wind. The Clark Canyon Dam project was recently approved by FERC after reapplication, and I thank you for that. We're still waiting on the Gibson Dam, but thank you for getting the Clark Canyon Dam project completed. Chair Murkowski, I'm out of time.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Senator Stabenow.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this hearing. I know that the testimony today has primarily been focused on how we need to streamline permitting and environmental reviews to spur economic growth. I want to raise a different issue that relates to economic growth that has been happening and a concern of mine. I am very concerned about the implications of large volumes of LNG exports and the recent announcements regarding investments by China in U.S. gas businesses. We've talked in the past on this committee for some time about the importance of low-cost domestic natural gas to manufacturing. The good news is, according to the industry analysts, low-cost natural gas in America was the catalyst for $160 billion in manufacturing investments in the last 7 years, since 2012. That's a big deal. That's very, very important to us. And yet, right now, our government is taking actions that will drive up gas prices, which is of great concern to the manufacturers that I talk to. The Energy Department has approved just under 55 billion cubic feet per day of LNG exports, which is a very large amount of gas. And the Energy Information Administration says natural gas prices will actually increase 218% by 2025. 2018% by 2025. with some of that increase directly tied to new LNG export facilities coming online. And now we have Chinese state-owned companies investing large amounts of capital in U.S. natural gas, which raises a lot of concerns, and I believe really requires closer scrutiny by all of us and what's happening with that. The Natural Gas Act requires that approval of shipments to non-free trade countries must be in the public interest. I don't believe the shipments of these magnitudes of gas could possibly be in the public interest. I don't oppose LNG exports, but I think rushing to export a resource that is critically important for American jobs in manufacturing is something that should be a shared concern for all of us. So, Mr. Turpin, I know FERC is responsible for the environmental review and not the ultimate approval of LNG exports, but could you speak to how low gas prices benefit the U.S. economy?
Well, as you stated, the Commission is involved in looking at the specific impacts related with the construction of those facilities. The economic analysis, the price impact analysis that you're referring to are things that are done by the Department of Energy, and so I really can't speak to those.
Anyone else want to speak to the importance, or maybe you don't think it's important to have low gas prices for domestic manufacturers, but I'm wondering if someone would want to speak to that, because it certainly has been an important part of increasing jobs in the last number of years in manufacturing. Mr. Russell, you're shaking your head.
I certainly agree. I mean, obviously, it's a major, energy is a big cost to mining, and so I echo your thoughts that the lower energy is very important to maintaining our competitiveness in our industry.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I really do think this is something, particularly with the Chinese investments in U.S. gas prices, U.S. gas projects really is something of concern to me as we go forward to be able to balance both the interests in exporting but also American jobs in terms of manufacturing. There's one other thing also that I wanted to raise that is, again, not quite on point of the hearing, but I think is really important to talk about, and that is pipeline safety as we look at going forward. I know that transporting oil and gas via pipeline certainly is safer than rail and other transportation modes, but at the same time, I'm very concerned that pipeline safety is not improving as we are talking about all these issues. Between 2010 2017, there were 4,269 pipeline incidences, resulting $3.5 billion in damages and 64 fatal injuries. And we know specifically in Michigan because of a line that burst, releasing 1 million barrels of oil into the Kalamazoo River, which was the largest ever U.S. inland oil spill that cost more than $1.2 billion to clean up. And we are currently concerned about gas and oil pipeline going under the Great Lakes, 64-year-old plus pipeline where there's great concern about the integrity and safety of the line. So I know that this, again, is about streamlining permitting for new pipelines, and I know FERC has jurisdiction over interstate gas lines, not oil pipelines. But again, I would ask Mr. Turpin, what is being done to ensure pipelines are safe by other federal agencies? Are you working with others on the safety end of things as all of this discussion is going on?
For the natural gas pipelines that are in the Commission's jurisdiction, of course, authority over the safety is under the Department of Transportation. We attempt to coordinate with them on their process. We involve them as cooperating agencies to the extent that they want to cooperate. And we have representation on their advisory committees for new pipeline rules.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I just a request that I would love to see us do maybe even a joint hearing with Commerce on pipeline safety issues at some point, just to raise, as we're talking about streamlining and moving forward, the safety issues are obviously very important as well. Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Senator Risch, I believe, is up next.
Well, thank you very much,
Madam Chairman.
Excuse me, wait, I am way out of line.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Gardner was
said
going to jump on you here. Yeah. You were sitting next to Senator Barrasso there, and I got confused. It is Senator Gardner. Excuse me.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. If it will make my seniority greater on Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Rich, I'm happy to yield to you. Thanks to all of you for your time and testimony today. Madam Chair, thanks very much for holding the hearing today. Ms. Barrasso, we've had many conversations over the past several years, beginning in 2011, talking about some of the permitting challenges that this great renewable energy project has gone through. One of our conversations was focusing on WAPA. You stated the Western Area Power Administration signed on as a Trans-West project participant in 2011, but now it's my understanding that they're taking a perhaps different view on whether they can be an equity partner versus a financier of the project. Could you just talk through what changed, why that changed, and why it's important?
Thank you, Senator Gardner. The statute itself that created Western's Borrowing Authority has not changed. It allows for constructing, financing, facilitating, planning, operating, maintaining, and studying construction of new electric power lines. And we actually are uncertain about why WAPA's view of how they can use their authority has changed, and you said it just right. They have changed their view from using it as potential equity for ownership to more of a financing mechanism, a revolving financing account. So I'm not sure why their attitude has, or why their view has changed, but our commitment in terms of wanting them to partner with us in a private-public partnership remains the same, as is our commitment to mitigate any risk that there would be to WAPA or the taxpayers in using their authority.
Well, thank you, and I hope we can get an answer from WAPA on this, this important question. Mr. Turpin, LNG exports, we've talked a little bit about it here today, such as Jordan Cove, which will export natural gas from Colorado. It's becoming a bigger issue because as more development in the Midwest takes place, we're losing access perhaps to some of the markets we've had, and so the Rockies gas can become a little bit more stranded perhaps, and so we need a Western outlet for that incredible gas production that we have. So the Jordan Cove project would allow us to export to Asia, a market that's critical to the U.S. from both an economic standpoint and a security standpoint. If you look at some of our potential trade partners there in South Korea, obviously a very incredibly important trade partner. If you look at Taiwan, very important trade partner. Look at Japan, very important trade partner, all of whom have expressed interest in a stable, affordable supply of energy from the United States. Helps us economically, creating tens of thousands of jobs in the western United States in particular, but it also gives our greatest allies the security that they need so they're not reliant on China or other nations for their energy. So this is both an economic and security imperative that we be moving forward with this. But the permitting process at Jordan Cove has been tough, it's been long, and of course FERC has made that even more complex with different rigorous standards and roadblocks have been put in place. What additional authority would be of help to FERC to accelerate the issuance of permits by cooperating agencies on a project once it's been approved by FERC?
I think you've hit probably on sort of one of the fundamental problems with how the U.S. has approached its permitting, and it's been to give sort of decentralized permitting authority to many different agencies, each of which that has a slightly different mission or a different take on the infrastructure. So I can't point to a single fix or a single authority to say, you know, give FERC this and things move better, because for the most part, what I've seen in my tenure at the Commission is that for every project, it's a different bag of issues that come up that are raised or that might need solutions. So, you know, but the only thing that makes sense is more of kind of what's been done with Fast 41 and others, is that accountability for agencies, and we can engage as much as we like with agencies. It's a can't lead the horse to, or can lead the horse to water kind of thing. We can get them on board, and yet in the end they still have their decision to issue under a federal authority, and that's what, they'll take their time doing.
So it's my understanding that FERC has not issued either a final or draft environmental impact statement in 2017, nor any orders, but there are 11 major LNG export projects that are now pending at FERC. So is there holdup? If there is, what is it, and when can we expect additional authorizations?
So the LNG projects that are there, probably the longest lead time item for those has been coordination with the Department of Transportation over their siting regulations. That has been something that's evolved over the last 4 or 5 years as plants have moved from import to export, a different range of hazards that need to be considered, and DOT's been working out how its siting regs can be applied. So I think that coordination, having that continue is vital, and having DOT put the resources needed to get those things solved is vital.
Well, thank you, and I've got additional questions, but I'm out of time. But I think it goes back to Ms. Perusso's comments at the very beginning when she laid out 3 things: consistency, coordination, and accountability. And I think you mentioned both consistency and coordination in your answer. We didn't quite get to accountability, but the accountability is there on our end to make sure that we solve this problem and make permitting a process that works for this country economically, and I look forward to doing that with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gardner. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Kaysen, I was surprised that the Interior Department's report on impediments to domestic energy development included no opportunities for improvement specific to permitting or siting of renewable resources on public land. 0. So for a number of years now, I've worked with Senator Heller on legislation to improve the process for siting wind, solar, and geothermal projects on public land, and we have a pretty substantial group of bipartisan co-sponsors now, including Senator Risch, Senator Gardner, Senator Daines, who was just here, all members of this committee. Does the department really not see any opportunities for improvement specific to clean energy projects on public land?
I think there's possibilities for drawing different conclusions about how to address those. I've personally had both solar and wind groups come in to visit with me about how we can do things better within the Department of Interior. Each of them have views of things that we can do, and we're taking a look at those. One of the chief.
What are your ideas for improving the process?
One of the chief things that seems to be an issue is in both siting wind and solar, they tend to sprawl over a fairly large area to make it economic to do. And one of the issues that seems to be in place is descriptions about BLM not being willing to allow those large areas to be set aside for them due to other, I'll say, complications like protecting endangered species or keeping open areas open. So it is an issue that we're taking a look at.
I mean, we do oil and gas at 40 and 160 acre spacings. How is that different than doing a wind turbine?
Well, the difference is you may take a 160 acres spacing and you have a well pad that takes up 100 feet by 100 feet out of that.
Which is approximately what a wind turbine also.
Well, one wind turbine, yeah.
Yeah.
And
but my point is that
for
on
solar
an oil and gas field, you might have tens of thousands of acres at 160 acre spacings. That doesn't really seem to be any different than a substantial wind project.
Okay.
And a solar project actually takes up less of a footprint, so I'm not sure I understand the logic.
Well, it depends on the size of the project. You can have very large projects or very small projects in all of the forms of energy. I'm not quite sure why we don't have some suggested improvements we can make on the renewables. But if you have particular suggestions to make, I'd be happy to run those down to ground and get them into the process.
We'd love to share our legislation with you.
Okay,
I want to go back to NEPA for a moment. I think most folks wouldn't care if an EIS can be done in 10 pages or 1,000 pages, so long as the individual EIS actually addresses and analyzes the relevant environmental issues. I think I'd be a little concerned, or at least I think there would be a concern that a hard cap, whether it's 300 pages or whatever the number is, on pages in an EIS could be seen as arbitrary. Do you understand that concern?
Yes, and it's not a hard cap, it's a goal. And the assistant secretaries under the secretarial order are allowed to go beyond the 300-page limit or 150 pages for easy EISs. So there is a mechanism in place in the secretarial order to exceed that threshold if it's needed.
I want to go back to one other thing you said. You said there were significant problems with Interior's methane rule, yet Colorado has very successfully implemented an almost identical rule. They've done that both successfully and profitably. Coming from a state where NASA has literally mapped the largest methane plume in the United States, a globally significant methane plume, I'm having a hard time understanding why this is taking so long. Can you go back and explain once again why this rule is not being implemented and why we're seemingly not prioritizing public safety?
Well, it's not a matter of not prioritizing public safety. On the venting and flaring rule, when I came to Interior as part of the beachhead team, I received feedback from within Interior that we were not well prepared to actually implement the rule, and received feedback from external groups that they were not prepared to comply with the rule and that certain things needed to be done to allow both parties to do their jobs well. We recognize that there are a number of states that have adopted their own regulations dealing with venting and flaring. What we chose to do is suspend the effect of the rule and then go back and basically take a look at a public comment process so we can get feedback from the general public and the industry regarding how we should do this rule better.
I'm over my time here, but I'll just share with you the frustration from my communities comes from looking across the border at BLM land in Colorado and seeing a set of regulations being implemented that have improved the way things are done and not seeing those changes in their own communities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Senator Brasso.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. Ms. Peruso, thank you for being here today to tell the story and tell us about your company's exciting project in Wyoming. In Wyoming, we're blessed with many energy resources. We have vast reserves of coal, of oil, of natural gas. And we also have world-class wind in addition to the uranium that we have. So it really is an all-of-the-above approach to energy dominance for America. And we need to use all of our energy resources to grow our economy and to keep energy prices low. Now, your company's project is a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project that's going to create jobs. It's going to deliver much-needed power to the Western grid. So I look forward to the continued progress of the project and the benefits that it's going to bring certainly to Wyoming, but also to the United States. Now, you explained in your testimony that the federal government has actually added substantial new fees to your company's project without prior notice. Specifically, I think you stated that the BLM's so-called competitive leasing rule issued in the final weeks of the Obama administration increased fees for wind and solar power generation projects that are developed on federal land. You also stated that this rule didn't grandfather in existing projects, including projects such as yours, that have been in development for years. So could you please describe the total cost impact of this rule that was in the final days of the Obama administration on this project, and explain whether you think that these increased fees imposed by the Obama administration will have a chilling effect on the future development of energy resources on public lands?
Yes, thank you, Senator Brasso. To put a little context on the time frame, we actually started construction on the wind project on September 9th, 2016. Exactly 3 months later, on December 9th, the BLM issued the final rule. The final rule does increase the fees associated with wind development on public lands. It will increase the fees for our project by an estimated $47 million to $106 million over the term of our development grant. And the purpose of the rule was to encourage development of renewable energy on public lands, and there are incentives in the rule for developers going forward that include streamlined permitting and some contractual advantages if you're located in a designated leasing area. However, we won't be receiving any of those benefits, nor will other developers like us who've already taken the risk to develop renewable energy on public lands. We are just getting this increased cost. So we shared our concerns with the administration throughout the rulemaking process with no success. And we are asking the committee to consider a provision in the energy bill that would exclude projects like ours from application of the rule. We understood that we were assuming risk when we went to develop our project on public lands, but we did that based on the rules of the game at the outset. And the rules should not be changed for projects like ours at this late date.
So this is something that a rule that came out not only late in the Obama administration, actually after the election, after it was obvious that the election results were in. So this was into December, in the final 6 weeks or so of the Obama administration, kind of a midnight rule that came out. In your testimony, you state that the Trans-West Express Transmission Project and the Chokecherry and Sierra Madre wind energy projects were designated as, quote, covered projects. You talked about that under the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, the FAST Act. You explained that the benefits of being designated a covered project are numerous, specifically challenges to agency decisions that approving a covered project must be made within a short time frame, and courts must consider the economic impact when evaluating a challenge to the project. So could you please elaborate on the benefits of being designated a covered project under the FAST Act and explain whether you think Congress should consider broadening that scope of eligible projects under the FAST Act?
Yes, thank you. We were notified that both the transmission project and the wind project were designated as covered projects in September of 2016, so towards the end of our permitting process. Because our projects were so advanced at that point in time, we weren't able to fully benefit from the dashboard and tracking provisions that you heard about. But they do provide a level of accountability, and we do appreciate the follow-up that we did receive under that program regarding the status of permitting. The other two benefits, though, that we see with the FAST Act relate to when agency decisions are challenged. Generally challenging agency decisions falls under the general statute of limitations for actions against the United States of 6 years. Under the FAST Act, the statute of limitations is 2 years after the date of publication in the Federal Register. The FAST Act also provides that as part of any preliminary injunction proceeding that could conceivably stop progression of a project, the court will consider an additional element that includes consideration of potential effects on public health, safety, environment, and also the potential for significant negative effects on jobs. So these two provisions, the 2-year statute of limitations and the additional preliminary injunction standard, give developers more certainty that any challenges to the agency's decision will be raised in a reasonable amount of time, and that the court will consider the wider effects of enjoining a project when determining whether a preliminary injunction is appropriate. So each of these factors reduces development risk and could assist in encouraging federal projects. And so if the applicability of the statute were broadened, it could be helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have some other questions I'll submit for written response. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this hearing. Mr. Kaysen, the BLM has sent a request to the U.S. Forest Service to determine whether 54,000 acres in the Ruby Mountains in Nevada are suitable for oil and gas leasing. This request is opposed by state environmentalists, hunters, anglers, and tribes. It also serves, if you don't know, the Ruby Mountains in northern Nevada serve as a critical habitat for several species, including the Lahontan cutthroat trout, which is Nevada's state fish. Can you tell me why the agency sent the request?
I'm sorry. It's often the case that the BLM manages the subsurface of our state out in the federal country. We have about 700 million acres of subsurface estate that we manage. And often we'll have Forest Service as a surface owner over our subsurface estate. So we collaborate with them to find out what their views are on prospective entries that we would make into the subsurface.
And can I ask why you made the request?
I'm not familiar with that particular request.
Can you get me that information, please?
Sure.
And the concern is this, that is a pristine area that is for decades been utilized by people in Nevada who support continuing the protection and do not support opening it up to oil and gas leasing. So I'm curious why the request all of a sudden came, who was behind the request and asked you to send that over to the Forest Service. So if you could provide that information, that would be very helpful.
Sure.
Thank you. So I am from the state of Nevada, where we actually have a history of mining, along with, we are an incredible state right now. We are leading the country in renewable energy with solar, wind, geothermal. So I appreciate the comments today, because this is something that I hear from both industries, is streamlining our processes, permitting process, doing away with the duplication, how we can do the coordination better amongst the federal agencies to help the companies and to continue to promote as well the industries. So let me ask this question. I guess, is it Ms. Flieger? My understanding is the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council was created to do just that, to engage in that coordination, streamline that permitting process. So, but it's only been in existence for about a year, is that correct?
The law was passed in December 2015, and the first permanent staff were hired in January. And we've been working with all of the permitting council agencies to do the very things that some of the non-government witnesses expressed. And I appreciate that. So you've heard the comments today. My thought is that you're there to do just address the issues that we've heard today. Nothing else needs to be done other than to let your agency do its job and coordinate amongst the federal agencies. Is that your understanding, or is that your intent with the committee or the council? Yes, the need for that they expressed, the coordination, the accountability, that's happening through the dashboard. Those principles are all part of Fast 41, and as we've been rolling it out and standing up the law, people are hearing about it more and more. The project's already benefiting. The next step that you're going to see are new projects are coming in and benefiting from Fast 41 at the start. As Ms. Peruso said, they were kind of covered as a pending project late in the process. As these new projects come in, that's the key thing, because right from day one, there'll be a lead agency assigned. That lead agency will bring together every cooperating and participating agency. And another one of the witnesses mentioned roles and responsibilities need to be defined. Yes, that's part of this coordinated project plan.
Accountability. And I apologize, I only have so much time. Yes. So do you need additional tools? Should we be giving you additional tools to address the concerns that we're hearing today?
One of the things in the President's fiscal year 2018 budget request of $10 million, that would allow us to use the existing Fast 41 tools to fully implement Fast 41.
Okay, and then thank you very much. And then Mr. Kaysen, the House Natural Resources Committee recently held a hearing on environmental regulation reform where they heard from a 27-year veteran of CEQ who testified that two of the greatest reasons that cause delays in NEPA reviews deal with capacity within the agency. One, lack of staff with responsibility for NEPA implementation, and two, lack of NEPA review training. Would you agree?
I think those are contributors.
So, and I'm running out of time, but I would like your thoughts, and I'll submit this for the record as well. A part of the thought with respect to giving responsibility back to some of the staff includes publishing notices of intent to the Federal Register. My understanding that is that's mandated now through DC. They have to come to DC instead of letting the BLM managers make that decision. I'm curious where you and the Secretary feel on publishing those registers and giving that authority back to those BLM managers in the state. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Now let's go to Senator Rich.
Well, thank you
Long
so
awaited.
much. I never thought you'd get
Yeah. Alphabetical.
Senator Masto, meet Mr. Russell, who helps make the Silver State. Fair statement, Mr. Russell? You know, in response to Senator Heinrich, he is quite right. I am a co-sponsor of the bill for helping streamline the processing for renewable energy. My only regret is all the sponsors of that wouldn't be co-sponsors of a bill to do the same thing for non-renewable energy. But nonetheless, we're at least all in agreement on the renewable energy. That brings me to you, Mr. Russell. I'm so glad you were able to come here and tell the committee the story of Rock Creek. I've tried to tell as many people as I can. I'll also try to put it in perspective. Since the permitting started, I finished up an almost 30-year career in the state Senate, served a stint as lieutenant governor, served a stint as governor, and now I've been here almost a decade. Are we getting close?
Chairman, Senator, I actually think we are. The Rock Creek project is scheduled to have a supplemental EIS and final record of decision in the first quarter of 2018. Unfortunately, that's 7 or 8 years after it was remanded back by the judge. Montanor, unfortunately, got caught up in the litigation as well and was remanded back. And the agencies are working to revise that record of decision. And I must say, somebody made the comment earlier, we have been very pleased with the attitude of the Forest Service to try to get this done. It just is taking a long time on both projects.
Well, thank you so much for your persistence. This is a project that's badly needed in the area that it's in for the reasons everyone stated with the poverty and everything else is here. In addition to that, I can say that having been intimately associated with this for decades, that HECLA has gone the way extra mile in seeing that the environment's going to be protected. Obviously, there's some very important lands, as you know, both in Montana and Idaho, that you've been very sensitive to caring for as you've gone through this process. So thank you for that. And most of all, these kind of stories are just staggering. When people go out as entrepreneurs, as people who are going to create wealth and make life better for Americans, and they get nothing but beat over the head from their government and very little help. So thank you for your perseverance through various administrations, decades, through recessions and everything else to get where you are, and keep it up. Someday we're going to get there, and we sure appreciate what you've done. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. Your description of your timeline, it just kind of boggles the mind. But Mr. Russell, you mentioned in your statement, you've got an extension for this expansion, this small expansion, 10 acres out at Greens Creek. And the reality is that you have to start the permitting request for the next leg of it before you've even allowed the ink to dry on the permit that is just granted, because it takes a full decade, and more than a full decade in many cases. Just quite incredible. Senator King.
Madam Chair, as I was listening to today's hearing, I'm reminded of a little-known passage in the Old Testament where God came to Moses and said, "Moses, I have good news and bad news." Moses said, "What's the good news?" God said, "I'm going to empower you to part the waters of the Red Sea, allow the Israelites to escape, and after they've escaped, the waters will come back and engulf the army of the Pharaoh." Moses said, "That's wonderful, God. What's the bad news?" God said, "You have to prepare the environmental impact statement."
You know, I've read the Old Testament. I'm pretty sure that's not exactly the way that story went.
I find this hearing fascinating because this is an issue I've been wrestling with for 30 years. I've been an environmental advocate, a developer, a governor, administrator, and what I said when I was a governor of Maine is I said we want the most stringent environmental standards in the country and the most timely, predictable, and efficient permitting process. And I think that's exactly what we ought to be reaching for. To me, there should not be a conflict between environmental standards and a timely and efficient permitting process. The question is, how do we get there? Mr. Russell, I think you outlined at the end of your testimony a set of standards that are worth discussing. As I made my notes, identify a lead agency. I think that's crucial. In our experience in Maine, having one agency that's responsible, not multiple serial permitting applications before multiple agencies, define the responsibilities of all the agencies that are involved in making contributions to the process, have parallel analysis among these agencies so it's not seriatim and therefore strings out the time, and then establish reasonable time limits and hold people accountable. Is that an accurate statement of where you think we ought to be headed?
Chairman, Senator, I think you've nailed that. That's exactly right. And I think the provisions of the FAST best management practices are right along those lines. Mining, however, is not currently a covered project. If we could bring mining into a similar regulatory regime, I think that would be tremendously helpful to accomplish those objectives.
Well, Ms. Flieger, I'm a little unclear on where your agency resides in the constellation of federal agencies. Are you within another department? Where are you independent? Where do you stand?
So the Permitting Council it's an independent council, and OMB was given the statutory authority to pick an agency to house it. We are housed in General Services Administration.
So the key is, I think you've articulated today, is to give you some funding so that you can continue the function. And the outline that I gave, is that essentially the direction that you're trying to move federal agencies?
Yes, and we are doing that. And as I just mentioned, it's when the new projects come on and they see these benefits from the start that you all will start to see the improvements and the streamlining of the permitting process.
My concern is that in this situation, we see the pendulum swinging back and forth to excessive and untimely regulation that impedes responsible development, but we don't want to swing back to the point where we open the floodgates to irresponsible environmental damage that we will have to live with for generations. So I think, Madam Chair, that's the challenge, is that we not in our desire to clean up the environmental, that's an odd choice of terms, clean up the regulatory process, that we not go too far and undermine the goals of which the regulatory process was established to protect. I do want to associate myself with Senator Stabenow. This is a separate issue. I am gravely concerned, Madam Chair, about the volume of natural gas exports. We had a hearing in this room 3 years ago. A witness for the natural gas industry sat where you're sitting, Mr. Turbin, that's why I'm looking at you, and said we will never export more than 9% of domestic production. We have now approved 55 billion BCF a day for export, and annual production is 78 billion BCF a day. The one law that this Congress cannot repeal is the law of supply and demand, and it concerns me that we are squandering one of the few advantages we have vis-a-vis Asia and China in terms of the support for manufacturing and the relatively low cost of natural gas. If we give that away to these competitors, it will simply be one less advantage we have. And Senator Gardner mentioned thousands of jobs. We're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs in the manufacturing sector that have been enabled by the low cost of natural gas. And I just am concerned. It's not relevant to this hearing, but I have to associate myself. I'm afraid we're going to look back in 4 or 5 years and say, what were we thinking? We've given away an enormous national advantage in the energy field that is tremendously important to our manufacturing sector. So with that, Madam Chair, I compliment you on this hearing. I think this presents very important issues that I'm certainly willing to work with you to try to address. Thank you.
I look forward to that, Senator King. And I would just note that Senator Inhofe has asked that a statement be included for the record in support of the bill that he has co-sponsored with you. This is S-1844, the Coordinating Interagency Review of Natural Gas Infrastructure Act of 2017. So we are going to include that statement from Senator Inhofe, just not exactly speaking to your point there, but talking about natural gas. So that will be included as part of the record. Senator Duckworth. We've just concluded with members, and you are next up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I squeaked in under the wire. Thank you. I just want to start by saying thank you for holding this hearing, and just to say that while I support efficient permitting systems and understand that it can be extremely challenging to industry, I do believe we have to be discerning on what projects we permit and where. For example, I vehemently oppose the administration's recent decision to make the largest ever reduction in public lands protection in American history at 2 national monuments. In fact, when Secretary Zinke was nominated to be Secretary of the Interior, he likened himself to President Teddy Roosevelt, the father of our national park system, and I cannot imagine a less accurate portrayal of Secretary Zinke's views of conservation. President Roosevelt is the father of the Antiquities Act and would never have recommended repealing land protections so that uranium mining, oil drilling, and coal mining can take place. Mr. Kaysen, does the administration have plans to move forward on permitting activities on these lands?
Not at this time.
Okay. Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to submit for the record a couple of items. One is a law review article published by the University of Virginia earlier this year that determines the president lacks the authority to reverse national monument designations.
That will be included.
Thank you. And then the second is an article that ran in the Washington Post detailing that a uranium mining firm urged the Trump administration to reverse land protections at Bears Ears.
We'll include that as well.
Thank you. I commend the state of Washington, which appears to have found a pathway forward on how to manage the workload associated with infrastructure permitting requirements. Mr. Brown, the Trump administration has proposed draconian budget cuts across the administration and has sought early retirements from our civil servants. In your opinion, would this make federal permitting more or less burdensome for industry?
I think the permitting process would be difficult with reduced funding for these oversight of these projects. If the federal projects, our partners that we work with, don't have the oversight ability to ensure proper environmental regulations, then that would fall to the states. And the state's authority, for example, 401 certification, we would need to condition those permits and those licenses in order to ensure that our water quality standards and other permit regulations are met. So as we lose expertise on the federal level with our federal partners, the states would need to make up for that. So I do think that losing funding in federal government level would impact the permitting process greatly on both the federal and the state side.
So do you think the states will be able to afford to come up with that additional, basically it's a cost shift from the federal onto the government? To the state government, excuse me.
There's pass-through funding for us to implement our delegated authority is often impacted as well. So we have less resources, and we must prioritize our regulatory oversight as well. And so with the water power license fees that we have, although it doesn't fully fund the program, it does sort of move those projects to the front of the line because they do have somebody in place with the expertise to be there for early engagement and to begin the permitting process. But funding at that level and working with industry to get those funding approved through state legislature is very difficult. We feel like we've been successful in working with our industry partners to maintain that fee.
Thank you. So having a fully resourced federal government is essential to guarantee that state governments can fulfill their role in the permitting process, essentially is what you're saying.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brown. On a related note, Ms. Peruso, your company has worked on 2 major energy infrastructure projects, a wind farm and a transmission project over the past decade. Can you please share your overall experience working with our federal employees? And by the way, wind power has added 100,000 jobs in Illinois over the last 10 years, so I'm a big fan.
That's exciting. Thank you. I don't think it's exaggerating to say over the last 10 years that we have worked very closely with federal employees, and we've participated in literally thousands of conference calls and meetings. And the projects would not be where they are today if it wasn't for the many federal employees at every level, from the field offices to the state offices to DC, who've worked really hard on the environmental analysis. Now, I'm not going to tell you that all the relationships always went well or that there weren't bumps in the road, but we were very fortunate in the end to have many federal employees who really took a real interest in the projects and were committed and are committed to seeing the projects through. And that's why our recommendations today in my testimony really focus on improving the framework that the federal employees are working under. If they have consistent policies that they can carry out, coordinate and communicate, but also with the corresponding decision-making authority, so it's not just coordination and communication without an ending, and then accountability regarding schedule and budget. And I think it's pretty universal that everybody performs better when there's a schedule and a budget. I can tell you the perfect example is I wouldn't have gotten my written testimony submitted Friday if there hadn't been a deadline.
Thank you. Thank you. Oftentimes, I need deadlines too. Madam Chair, I'm out of time. You've been very generous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Hoeven.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks for holding the hearing. Secretary Cason, I recently introduced legislation that reforms the BLM permitting process for permit to drills, APDs for oil wells, where the BLM owns no surface acres, but owns mineral acres under that area. We'd like to be able to go ahead and permit if they own, without their going through their BLM approval process, if they own less than 50% of the mineral acres, because we'd go through the other approval processes. And in essence, a minority of the ownership with no surface acreage impact to BLM surface acres is holding up the majority owner on the minerals. So that's essentially how the legislation works. We actually moved a version of it through here, I think it was last year, and it didn't get passed across the floor, but we're continuing to work it. And again, it's just about trying to have a common sense way to expedite APDs. So I'd like your reaction to that and whether or not you're willing to support that type of effort.
We're always happy to have any flexibility to move our processes along more efficiently than they are right now. So we'd be happy to work with you on the legislation and offer comments or suggestions on how we can make things better.
Yeah, again, it goes back to common sense. In other words, if you have no surface acre impact, if you're a minority holder in the minerals, if it frees up time and resources for you to go take care of surface acres where you have issues, it seems to me you get more done with less people, and it works all the way around, both in terms of the APDs, but also your ability to manage your surface acres where you have them.
Right. And
it also generates revenue because you get revenue from those producing wells.
Right. We'd be happy to work with you on the legislation, and anything that moves the process along, we would be happy for.
Yeah, so there's a little salesmanship here, so somebody who maybe isn't for fossil fuels understand that there's actually benefits on both sides of the equation. In terms of good BLM land management?
Well, we certainly have to set priorities all the time. There's not enough resources to go around to do everything that we would like to do. So any way that we can prioritize our resources by making the job easier to do or more straightforward or more efficient is something that we'd like to try to do.
Yeah, and along that same line, our coal miners, and we do lignite coal mining, which is strip mining, reclamation, are still having trouble getting permits. It's taking too long. And what happens then is they end up going around federal lands, around BLM lands, okay? So you just miss out on the revenues and so forth, and it makes it more costly for them. And so, you know, we really need a way to find to expedite that process. My sense is it would be useful for you or the right person to come out to North Dakota and visit with our miners and see what they do and see their reclamation. I mean, you can't tell. I mean, once they reclaim that land. So I'd like your reaction to that.
Well, one of the things that we encountered at the beginning of the administration was I'll call it the war on coal and everything related to coal. And the effect of the government's policies in the last administration was to shut down a lot of our coal resources and our permitting capabilities. So this President Trump has said the war on coal is over, and we have had a secretarial order and an executive order to basically get to that effect. We're currently implementing changes to our coal program so that we can lease more coal. We've had a very large coal sale so far this year. So we are trying to make that resource available across the board. Our administration's basically in all of the above kind of energy. And we are trying to actively embrace all the forms of energy, including coal, including oil and gas, including solar and wind. And the thought process is we're not going to try to pick winners and losers. That will have the marketplace actually do that. So our job is to make the resources available, and then the market can sort out which one's the most effective.
Good. Well, then I would like to work with you to kind of follow up. I think coming out and seeing what we do is quite eye-opening. I think people don't realize the quality of the work, the reclamation.
Okay.
We're #1 in the country in reclamation, #1.
Okay.
So it'd be great to have you do that.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I'd beg indulgence for one more question, recognizing I'm over my time here. But Director Flieger, in regard to permitting improvement for federal infrastructure, can you tell me what concrete steps the administration is taking or will be taking to expedite and improve infrastructure siting processes?
So there's two tools available. There's Fast 41, the law, as well as the Executive Order 13807. And the kind of fundamental principles that we're currently using, and this is a 16-member permitting council. It's early coordination and collaboration, so bring every agency that has a permitting role in the project together at the start of the project. Once a quarter, they're required to update what's called a coordinated project plan. So they're having those conversations at the beginning and then regularly throughout the process, and they can address difficult issues. That's #1. #2 is accountability. They're required to put a timeline on a public dashboard, and that gives the project sponsors the certainty and the clarity they need, and as well as providing the public and any stakeholders with information on specific target dates for a permit. And then there's also my office, the Office of the Executive Director, where a project sponsor can come, and whether it's informal and we'll work with agencies on a specific project, or there's a formal dispute resolution process. All of those things are being used to streamline the process.
Okay, and I'd really encourage you to work with the states as much as you can do a state-led approach to help you with that process. I think it would be beneficial. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hoeven. And Mr. Kaysen, I would certainly encourage you to take Senator Hoeven up on his offer to visit North Dakota. I had an opportunity to go there several years ago, and that was all that the people wanted to talk about, was the situation with BLM and how on these areas you just had such an impediment to any level of development because things just took longer. You mentioned this is all about common sense in terms of how these APDs were issued, but it was really eye-opening for me to see and understand how you can have a level of good, solid economic activity. You mentioned the reclamation efforts and all that goes with that, but then when you have the federal lands, an entirely different scenario in terms of how the process proceeds. It was an important visit.
Sounds like a great trip.
Particularly this time of year, right, Senator Hoeven?
It's the high in D.C. today will be 48. The high in Bismarck, North Dakota today will be 50.
There you go.
Yeah,
Make
sounds
your
perfect.
reservations today. Yeah. Let me ask one more question, and This relates to NEPA. It's been mentioned a little bit, and some of you in your testimony here, but it seems that we've kind of moved away from a NEPA process that allows for this interaction between the permit applicants and the agencies to ask the questions, to provide some clarity, and to have that understanding. What it seems we've moved to now is more of an arm's length transaction where you can't have the, hey, we've got a question over here, well, let me help you clear that up over there. That adds to time delays. That adds to greater uncertainty. So we hear that that move or that direction to more of an arm's length transaction rather than the ability to work some of these things out as you're moving through the process. The other thing that I've heard, and Senator Duckworth mentioned a little bit in her question to you, Ms. Pruso, about the federal employees that you work with, those that are part of the agencies. One of the things that I hear is that you have a level of turnover within the agencies that if you are in a multi-year process, as Senator Risch has outlined, or as Mr. Russell has indicated that HECLA has gone through, where you have projects that are taking years and years and years, and you go back to the same agency, and now you have a different person, and basically you're retelling your story all over again. So the question, and I'll just throw it out there, I guess to you, Mr. Kaysen and Ms. Flieger, in terms of what you think we can do to get back to a more collaborative approach that can help answer some of the preliminary questions, and then to those on the applicant side, Ms. Pruso, Mr. Russell, how bad is the situation with staff turnover and what that then does to elongating this permit process? So let's start with you on what can we be doing to reinstitute this collaborative approach?
The long-term length of a lot of these projects do lend themselves to encounter staff turnover, that's for sure. One of the things that we're trying to do in Interior to combat that is we're going through a process right now of building a standardized NEPA compliance process and training so that all of our NEPA practitioners basically end up with the same grounding of what's required under NEPA and the CEQ rules, so that if you get a new face in the job, that at least they're operating from the same set of standards that we're trying to imply. One of the things that we've found so far in our NEPA streamlining process is that each of our agencies end up doing NEPA just a little bit different. And so we're trying to get past that and standardize it. A second thing that we're trying to do is really examine the CEQ rules and the NEPA process and make sure that we're cutting out of the process any of the things that are extraneous and not required by the statute or the regulations. So that should help as well. And then we're trying to build a broader cadre of NEPA specialists who, if we have a vacancy, we have somebody that's on the back bench that can come in and fill in on the project. It probably won't do a lot for the specifics of an individual project because each of those tend to be different, but it can help a lot if you insert a new person in that has the same background and training, that they can take over the project, learn the specifics about the project much more quickly, and create less confusion and disruption of the process.
Ms. Flieger, on the collaborative side, anything we can be doing more?
One thing I would say about the collaborative side, I've mentioned the coordinated project plans and how important they are. They require a plan, and again, this is at the start of a project and then with a quarterly update, a plan for public and tribal outreach. So that's built into the structure of FAST 41. To piggyback on what Jim was saying about Interior, Our best practices report, just released last week, addresses the very issue you just described about staff turnover and the need for training. That's one of the best practices FAST 41 requires that we focus on, training and making sure that that project knowledge can move from one person to the next when there is turnover, because we understand how important that is, and as projects take time, we want to conserve and use the knowledge already built up.
How about from the applicant side? Ms. Prosu.
We absolutely experienced a high turnover rate in the federal employees we were working with. For example, during the 10 years our two projects have been moving forward, all of the BLM state directors in all 4 states, all of the district managers, all of the BLM project managers, and then many of the resource specialists have turned over at least once and sometimes more than once. And there's no doubt that that turnover led to a loss of momentum as new staff came in and tried to get up to speed on where the project was, what had been done, what needed to be done. And sometimes there was disagreement with what had been done. And this is where consistent policy and clear guidance would be very helpful, and as well as communication and coordination as these staff turnovers take place.
Very interesting.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, certainly the project manager is key. I've seen projects that have worked very, very well with good project managers that understand NEPA, understand what project management is, and drive the process. It has been a big issue for us at the Greens Creek situation. The Corps of Engineers went through 2 project managers, and nothing happened for a year. At Rock Creek, 11 months was lost when 1 biologist left the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Nothing happened. So those resources are very, very important. The role of the applicant is also very, very important. I believe NEPA still allows for applicants to prepare environmental assessments. And early in my career, applicants would prepare those. The agencies would review and approve them. We've moved away from that primarily because of fear of litigation. But that would be one way to get back to streamlining environmental assessments rather than EISs. Also at Greens Creek, we experienced because of this arm's length relationship that the Forest Service was developing independently alternatives to our proposal that were not technically or economically feasible. So a lot of time and energy was spent developing those alternatives, and when it finally came to preparing the final document, it was only then that they reached out to us and said, can you do this? And the answer was no, it's not technically or economically feasible. So getting the applicant more involved earlier in the process can address the points that you've raised on point, that you get a more streamlined and efficient process without reducing any rigor in the analysis. It's just much more efficient.
Mr. Turbin, do you want to add anything to this?
Sure. I think the sentiments I've heard on sort of both sides of the table are things that we've experienced at the Commission. We have relatively, in terms of project managers, low turnover. But that being said, you lose that key person, and it does have an impact for the project. That's why for the larger, more complicated projects, we'll have deputy project managers and others to try to ensure that institutional knowledge is there and that we don't have those sort of hiccups. I do think we've experienced much more turnover, or witnessed much more turnover in the other federal agencies, especially in the smaller regional offices, where it may be that the sole piece of institution, or the sole vessel of institutional knowledge, once they leave, that office is starting over from scratch, and that has been a problem we've seen over and over.
Yeah, that is a problem. We see it. Senator King.
Madam Chair, that was a really good question, and we've identified in the Armed Services Committee one of the problems with the federal procurement process is turnover. And the loss of a project manager following through, and it's one of the reasons the procurement process in the Defense Department takes so long. But I think there's an additional point here, and that is it's often easy politically to talk about shrinking the government and hiring freezes and fewer people. That directly impacts the speed of your permitting process. I mean, we're talking about changing regulation, but if you don't have the people do the analysis and to do the required steps that it takes. And I think we need to understand that you can't on the one hand talk about a more efficient permitting process and on the other hand talk about firing people and shrinking the size of whether it's the EPA or the Department of the Interior or the Forest Service, whatever. There's an inconsistency there, and I think that point needs to be made.
Well, you have made it, and I'm reminded that oftentimes I will hear complaints from constituents or other folks that say, you need to reduce the size of that agency until they want their permit approved. And then it's like, where are all the people in your agency?
Then they complain that nobody answers the phone.
Yes, yeah. We know the problem, and you're living it. This has been very informative, very instructive this morning. This last exchange about the imperative to have the people in place, the knowledgeable folks in place, is a challenge for us. And I think we recognize that we can pass legislation, whether it's Fast 41 or whatever it is, we can put in place processes that allow for streamlining and efficiencies, but we still have to have the folks that actually make it all happen. So how we work to find that balance, again, is part of our challenge here. But I thank you each for what you have contributed to the conversation this morning. As we look to ways that we can move the economy, it is very clear. It's not a Republican idea or a Democrat idea. We saw with the Obama administration, they said we need to do something about the regulatory permitting process. President Trump comes into office. We need to do more about the regulatory permitting process. Our challenge is to do more about the regulatory permitting process and actually see that translate on the ground. As you point out, Senator King, none of us are wishing to shortcut environmental considerations that would put at risk our economy. We do expect to have stringent and good standards, but we also expect a level of certainty and predictability, and one that doesn't stretch out a permitting process for literally decades, where people have worked on a certain project for a generation. That's not the goal here. So we have work to do, but we appreciate what you all have contributed to the conversation. With that, we stand adjourned.
Hi, how are you today? We can do that.
Not as part of the tax bill, but yes, I do believe that there will be an extenders that will incorporate much of the concerns, whether it's wind or solar or any of the nuclear PTC.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Have you received any assurances from leadership that the extenders package would certainly follow the package, passage of a larger bill?
I have not received assurances in terms of timing, other than that there is a great deal in making sure that we have these standards.
I just know some in the industry are concerned that, the people may say it happens, and then it just doesn't end up happening.
Oh, I understand. But your ask is, have I received certainty? What I have received is an indication of a very, very clear desire to resolve these standards.
What about the energy bill with all this talk about permitting? What's the latest getting that going? Energy and natural resources.
Energy and natural resources. That's a wonderful legislative product that Senator Cantwell and I put hands and think on the calendar. My hope, my wish is that see this take off. January seems like we do really good bipartisan work here. January, I'm looking forward to that.
How about the EIA and your nominees? Do you think they could get paid for them?
I'm hoping that they'll be part of the kind of the wrap up of things this next week.
Senator, with Michael Dorson, the nominee, you don't have an opinion of him yet?
Senator, thank you so much for inviting us.
I appreciate it.
Just keep doing what you do.
Well, keep it up.